What's going on, guys? My name is Steve. Thank you for stopping by my channel. Today we're going to be reacting to how do they teach the American Revolution in Britain. I came across this video and I thought it would tie in very well to yesterday's video, a British perspective about America's Independence Day. You know, I'm really curious, what are you guys in Britain taught about the American Revolution, and how much time do your teachers actually spend on this subject? You know, I'm really curious if in the American schools and British schools, if they're pretty much taught the same things about the American Revolution, or if it's a little bit different. In the comments section of yesterday's video, it seems like most British people are saying they really aren't taught a whole lot about the American Revolution in school. It's not something that they really spend a lot of time on. And, you know, I can understand that. It really does make a lot of sense why that would be. You know, in America, obviously, the American Revolution would be a huge event. You know, gaining your independence as a country obviously is one of the biggest events in your country's history. But in Britain, for example, you know, Britain has a much longer history. And so they're going to have a lot more huge historical events that they're going to have to teach to their children in British schools. And so, you know, you've got to weigh what's important to teach British children versus not as important to spend a lot of time on. And, you know, I didn't really think about this before, but some people pointed this out in the comment section of that video that, you know, Britain had a huge amount of British colonies. And so a number of British colonies gaining their independence over time. And so to think that America gaining their independence would be something that British children would spend a huge amount of time learning about probably wouldn't make much sense. But nonetheless, I'm very curious on what you guys in Britain are taught about the American Revolution and how much time you guys spend on it and whatnot. I just think this would be a very interesting video to check out. So anyways, guys, let's go ahead and dive in and check out how do they teach the American Revolution in Britain.
This video is made possible by the Great Courses Plus, an on-demand video learning service, learning your own pace with no tests and no schedules. Check out the Great Courses Plus through the link in the description below. More about them a little later. The American Revolution is one of the historical events that, together with things like the French Revolution among other things, helped usher in the modern era. The Americans, on the whole, tend to be proud of this event and focus on it heavily in their school curriculum, as it heralds the birth of their nation and the triumph of a handful of terrorists against their government and fellow countrymen. But what do schools in Britain have to say about the American Revolution? To begin with, on the surface, if one talks to people on the street or reads a British book on the subject, Americans will perhaps be positively surprised to see that today there are no hard feelings in England regarding the Americans' choice to leave the glorious British Empire. May it reign forever. But really, we don't care. It seems like a peachy divorce with no grudges held or hostile views taken. After all, for the last century at least, the UK has been the closest ally of the US in Europe, with mutual support in all major conflicts of the 20th century, and both follow similar policies so consistently that the UK has, on occasion, been ironically referred to as the 52nd state. But there is a catch. While the American Revolution is a cornerstone of American history, in Britain, well, it seems that the subject of the American War of Independence, as it is known in the UK, is rarely mentioned in British education books of past and present, or at least not in any great detail.
Really?
That's not to say it's not mentioned anywhere, simply that while they may learn a little about early American history, including the War of Independence, it's more of a footnote in British history. It's probably also worth mentioning that when it is mentioned, it is never seen from a nationalistic point of view. For example, we don't angrily shake our fists at a picture of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Rather, it's covered frankly, and then we move on swiftly to more interesting and relevant subjects to British history. For example, the focus in history is much more centered around things like the Roman times. For example, the legendary resistance of Queen Boudicca against the might of Rome, or later periods such as the 100 Years' War and the intrigues of the Tudors generally trying to keep track of all the beheadings in the Tower of London. In more modern times, emphasis is put on a issues such as industrialization, colonialism, and the post-colonization era, as well as the events during the World Wars and internal reforms. As to the aggression of the British Empire, while many certainly complain that it's not fully represented, it is far from omitted. British imperialism, for example, in Africa, is of course addressed. So why not focus on the American War of Independence and the birth of one of the most influential nations in modern history? It seems that the lack of details when teaching about American independence is not due to shame, envy, or part of a continuous effort to hide the UK's colonial past, as, say, the case might be in Japan. Rather, the main reason is the unspectacularly trivial fact that the American Revolution is seen as a minor detail in comparison to other events directly related to British history.
That is exactly kind of what I was, trying to say in the beginning of this video. And it's something that I hadn't really taken into account before, that, you guys have such a long history and so many huge historical events that there's really no way that you could put one of your colonies gaining their independence as something that would be worthy of, spending a huge amount of time teaching the kids. It's something that, sure, teach it briefly. This happened, America was at one point a British colony, but then you move on. I totally get it. It totally makes sense. It's just not something up until now, I've really ever even thought about. Is something that, just never come from that perspective before. It's definitely interesting, but it definitely makes a lot of sense.
The US breaking off was simply just one of many nations that did it for a whole lot of reasons.
Totally get it.
Indeed, if one looks at the larger scope, more than 60 countries celebrate independence from the British Empire, which in its heyday had control over 1/5 of the globe's population. That would amount to, on average, one Independence Day celebration of a country every week in a given school year. A phlegmatic English answer would be to say that we have better things to focus on than every country's Independence Day.
It does make me wonder, do you guys focus on any country's Independence Day for any length of time? Like any of these other, 60, I believe you said, colonies that broke away? Do you guys spend any major amount of time on any of those breaking, or any of the countries gaining their independence? Or is it pretty much the same as, America gained their independence? It's just something that is maybe briefly touched on, but not really something that is focused on at all.
So, the American Revolution is equated with other similar events, and it is rather addressed as an armed uprising of an important but distant rural populace against taxes, so hardly unique in history. The importance of ideas such as enlightenment, freedom, and democratic values are viewed by Americans on the basis of their revolution as one prime example thereof, but the schools in the UK, similar to most European countries, focus on other incidents. Some of them are closer to home and widely acknowledged as shaping history, such as the French Revolution. Another example is the post-colonialism era in Asia and Africa as one of the main facets of world history. These, rather than American independence, are considered to provide the historical depth necessary for such discussions in the UK classrooms. Thus, the War of American Independence will most likely come up as an addendum, providing context when dealing with the French Revolution or with trade regulations within the British Empire as an example of a taxation policy gone wrong. It can also be related to the long-term effects of the 7 Years' War, which may be considered one of the causes that would eventually lead to the higher taxation that in turn ignited the revolutionary actions in the Americas. Of course, that does not mean that American history is shunned from British schools, far from it. The developments of civic rights, the role of American industrialization, and the combined efforts with the British in the World Wars and the Cold War are placed highly in various stages of the curriculum.
Again, it's just what is of major importance to British children learning. I mean, that totally makes sense. And it's really interesting that, thinking of the American Revolution from these two different perspectives, one being America, trying to gain their independence, and two, basically, these were, Britain looking at it as these were British citizens moving over and trying to break away from Britain. It's really interesting to think about it from these two individual perspectives.
be it in the early key stages of the English system or adapted for older students of 15 to 18 years, such as during the A-level and GCSE exams. To give an example within the history books provided by AQA, that's a blast from the past. Out of more than 30 titles covering the period from the Crusades up to the 21st century, two refer directly to the USA. The Making of a Superpower, USA, 1865 to 1975, and The American Dream, Reality and Illusion, 1945 to 1980. The titles are indicative of the thematic stressed in each book. Notice that there is no book specifically dealing with the USA before 1861. Besides these reasons, the lack of emphasis on the American Revolution could be seen as related to the political scene within the UK itself. The UK is regarded by some as a fragile nation, as emphasized by much talk of independence by individual regions, especially in the last decade. The independence of a mainly English-speaking American colony, which is also culturally related to England, is much more on par with the Scottish or North Irish independence movements than, say, the Indian independence of 1947. But to sum up, in general, the American Revolution is not negatively portrayed in British schools, as some might first assume. Rather, it is seen as one of many world history events which are linked to the understanding and teaching of UK history without being particularly vital to it, and thus not really worth covering in depth. And I'll just add on a personal note here that when we started doing this series of how is so-and-so taught in another part of the world, someone asked me this on Twitter, and my response is just, it's just not taught. We don't really look at it. And, well, now you've had the more in-depth answer. And
so it's not really taught. It's just something that just comes up. Is that basically it? It's like something that is just, you're not going to basically go to class and there's going to be a whole class about the American Revolution. Is something that is just basically is tied in with the French Revolution, for example. It's something that is just briefly spoke about, but I think that's what he's basically saying.
Let's get into today's bonus fact. Ever wonder what the difference between the UK, England, and Great Britain is? Honestly, yes, sometimes, even as a British man. The actual name of the sovereign state we are talking about here is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the UK. The United Kingdom is made up of the countries England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The confusion of the terms seems to revolve around the term country and the political powers that are perceived based on that word. While the four countries that make up the UK are generally considered separate in the minds of locals, and in certain sporting events, their powers for local law and control are devolved from the UK. Think of the 50 states of the United States. While each state has their own set of laws, they are all under the power of the federal government. In the case of the UK, it is somewhat similar, though certain responsibilities are also implied, like healthcare and education, that are delegated to 3 of the 4 countries. The responsibilities that are delegated differ from one country to the next. England is the only country in which the UK does not devolve any powers, and instead it is legislated directly by the UK government. When it comes to international politics, it is the sovereign nation of the UK that is recognised, and not any of the 4 constituent countries. The term Great Britain refers to the landmass that comprises England, Scotland, and Wales. Something that aids in the confusion as to the difference between Great Britain and the UK.
I can't tell you how interesting it was when I first learned all this. I learned all this like at the beginning of my journey on this channel. But it was really interesting. I had no idea. I think this is probably something I was taught in school, but it definitely wasn't something that was really, again, it's not something that was taught in depth. I guess it's kind of the way you guys aren't really taught much about the American Revolution. And obviously I really wasn't taught in depth about, how the different countries in the UK were made up or whatnot,
UK is that the term is sometimes internationally used as a synonym for the UK. For instance, the UK's Olympic team competes under the name Great Britain, and the ISO, International Organization for Standardization, gives the UK the country codes of GB and GBR. This can be confusing given that the ISO also codes England, Scotland, and Wales as subdivision countries of the UK, but Northern Ireland as a subdivision province. If you're getting the impression that Northern Ireland is the red-headed stepchild of the UK, you may be you right, both figuratively and literally, we suppose. The confusion over the definition of these four countries in reference to the UK is further muddied up in sporting competitions. There are several international sporting events like the Commonwealth Games and football competitions in which each of the four has their own team and they do not compete under a unified national team. When competing under these conditions, their nations are referred to as home nations. Because each team is from a specific home country, it can lead some to think that these countries have political autonomy as well. If you're curious about when these unions between the countries that comprise the UK came about, it happened as follows. England and Wales were joined in 1536. Scotland and England were joined together in 1707, along with the previously joined Wales, to officially form the Kingdom of Great Britain. Ireland decided to join up in 1801, at which point the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was formed. In 1922, however, many of the southern counties of Ireland decided to remove themselves from the Union, and the UK changed their name to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So, in summary, Great Britain is England, Scotland, and Wales. The UK is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and the full name is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. England is just the part of the island that is England. So
yeah, that was a good video, guys. I didn't know we were going to go into this bonus section here. I knew that, information about what makes up Great Britain and what makes up the UK. And, I must admit, it's still so interesting to think about, because it's like the UK is a nation within itself, but you have the four separate nations within the nation. And so it's just it's hard to wrap your mind around it, at least at first. But anyways, guys, that's not really the topic of this video, why we watched it in the first place. But I think basically what I understand is you guys just generally don't spend a lot of time on the American Revolution. Makes total sense. I get it. It was in the big scheme of things in British history, it was a blip on the radar, in the middle of a ton of other huge historical events, and just makes a lot of sense, It sounds like you're basically, it is taught, I wouldn't even say, based off what he says, it doesn't even seem like it's literally taught. It seems like it's something that's not really taught in too much detail. It's something that is basically mentioned in passing when you're talking about other historical events, maybe such as the French Revolution, like he mentioned here. But yeah, guys, let me know in the comments if this was kind of accurate, an accurate representation of how you were taught about the American Revolution, or if you were taught about it at all. Or maybe, like I saw in the comments of that previous video, a few people, it seemed like it was maybe, it seems like maybe 5% of people said they were actually taught about the American Revolution in depth. I'm sure, in certain classrooms, in certain areas around Britain, you're going to probably find certain teachers that may focus a little bit more on certain things. And so I'm sure some teachers may focus on it a little bit more, but as a whole, it sounds like it's not something that's really focused on. I keep on repeating myself, but that's pretty much what I gathered from this video. But anyways, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. Please click that like button. Feel free to drop your comments or suggestions about this video or others. And don't forget to subscribe to continue to follow me on my journey to discover my British and Irish ancestry. Until next time, guys, peace.